Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Pharaoh Dynasties. And what I want to do in this video is talk about certain mechanics that do exist in the Total War Saga Troy that Creative Assembly Sophia could potentially implement in Pharaoh in order to enhance the experience. Now, don't get me wrong, the way they have handled Dynasties is far superior than how Troy is right now in a lot of ways. The balance, lethality, overall campaign situation, balancing between campaigns, because yeah, the Chians compared to the Trojans are the significantly better faction. But there are still certain things. First off, let's talk a bit about resources, because there's a couple of interesting things to consider over here with resources. First off, when we're talking about resources, provincial capitals do not typically provide resources over here in Troy. Instead, resources are generated through minor settlements, which means you have to defend those minor settlements or you're literally going to run out of money, such as it is. Now, there's certainly some problems with the way the resource system works in Troy as opposed to Pharaoh. There's too much of an emphasis on the enormous power that gold does have in a campaign. So over here, for instance, if I'm playing Ajax, I absolutely 100% of the time want to go to war against Athens purely because they have that gold mine, because that gold mine is going to give me a significant amount of power. So that can be a problem. But let's consider this. When we're looking at settlements in Troy with resources, you don't just have one or two resource buildings for a particular resource, and sometimes you only even have one, depending on the faction you're playing as. No, instead you have 5 different resource buildings, each of them with their pros and cons. So the most basic one is also the cheapest one. It works like this. You get, in this case, it generates some lumber, and the more influence, and if you have a high influence level in a particular settlement, which I certainly do over here, and I'm going to get even more, then you will gain even more resources. So that's the easiest one to get, cheapest one to build. The second building is typically going to provide some resources, but also another benefit. In this case, with lumber, you're going to be looking at getting ammunition for your ranged units. But there is a cost with this. You lose influence. Now, I find this loss of influence a bit ridiculous, but it does force you to think about your settlements in a bit of a different way than you do in Pharaoh. In Pharaoh, influence is very easy to set up, and you typically don't care about losing it. Like, you don't generally worry too much about losing influence once you already have it. And there's plenty of ways to get it with the gods in particular shrines. Then the third building, it typically increases resources that you're generating. And it increases at the highest tier, at tier 3, increases all resources that that particular type faction wide. So this can be a significant benefit, more so long-term as opposed to a short-term benefit. The fourth building is basically a far more expensive one, and it also costs gold, stone, and gold, which certainly are more difficult to acquire than just, say, wood. But it does generate a higher amount of resources, 125 with a high influence benefit of 192 as opposed to 64 and 81. So a lot of resources over there, but it does cost quite a bit. And then finally, the last one does generate a significant amount of resources, but doesn't have that high influence benefit, and it also affects your workforce growth or your growth by a fairly significant amount. What this system does is it forces you to worry about like the pros and cons of this. Do you just want the most basic resource? Okay, you can go for that. It's no problem. But you got to be prepared to pay the cost for that. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm certainly not going to cry over lacking agents because I've never been too much of a fan of agents. Like the assassins in particular, like it's either a situation where they're either overpowered or they're completely freaking useless in a campaign. Like, you pretty much want to have certain agents in an army. Like, you want to have an envoy in pretty much every army for all kinds of benefits. So, Pharaoh's decision to remove those completely, I would actually say is a good thing overall. It could be ridiculous. Mind you, they've kind of folded it into the court system or embed informant in a faction, so you do still have some of that functionality still available, or pretty much all of the functionality. It just works in a different way as opposed to like just building some Uber spy and using that to assassinate all your opponents that you might encounter. So it's a good thing that Pharaoh did decide to go down that path. So those are some core gameplay mechanics that I do feel Troy does better, but of course the Pharaoh does its own things better in certain ways. I do certainly miss having research over here that can give you a certain amount of resources on a baseline level, because this can be incredibly useful, especially because the AI can benefit from this immensely, as I feel like some baseline level of every type of resource would be useful for the AI. I don't know if they have it, but I've seen so many factions running out of stone, out of bronze, gold, that it's not, and wood, and they also have an enormous amount of food. So what ends up happening in Pharaoh is you end up fighting these crappy armies that are made up pretty much of food-only units, which is not great. Sure, you can lower the upkeep and give the AI a benefit, but if they're not going to have those resources to begin with, then that is certainly going to be a problem. So another thing that I feel Troy can do better, or does better. Another thing on top of this that we do have, it is actually related to objectives in a campaign. So with Troy, regardless of who you're playing, you do have a certain number of quests or objectives that you can complete. You have these missions, or rather the epic missions that each character is on, that they aim to accomplish. This gives you some focus to a campaign. Now, not every campaign was built in the best possible way, but many of them are great. And it certainly adds more, not necessarily variety, but it certainly attaches you to playing a campaign more than others if you're going to have different objectives to go for in those campaigns. Okay, beyond that, there are certainly some mechanics that they've taken from Troy into Pharaoh, like for instance the diplomacy benefit that Ajax has over here. It's been folded into one of the ancient legacies. One of the things I do wish they would have added as well would have been the ability to have the path to greatness, because this gives you various diplomatic benefits. Basically, the way this works is you acquire a certain portion of resources, and then you go challenge certain champions with a full army over here, or some level of force, and then you gain them as a special kind of unit that you can recruit in your faction. And this is a really good system because it gives you those kind of unique battles that you can fight in a campaign as Ajax. So that is another thing that I think Pharaoh could benefit from. I would also add that it could be great to have multiple ancient legacies that you can run at the same time, or maybe you start with one and you can unlock one later on, something along those lines. Though I don't know how to feel about that, because that would just incentivize you to, if they would have to be unlocked separate at different times, that would just incentivize you to always go for a freaking merchant as Egypt, because it's the most powerful one by far and it's a significant early game benefit. But I do think multiple ancient legacies should be something that CA Sophia should look into, if they're going to add any kind of major updates to Pharaoh. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Who knows with CA, right? They say one thing and then their plans change, because they do change because situation changed. Maybe they had no intention of making any bit more content for Pharaoh after Dynasties came out. Though, from what I've heard from the leaks, they're trying to convince people to buy the game in the first place, and maybe, since a lot more people are playing it right now, they might decide to actually add more content. Maybe, maybe not. Now, talking about other mechanics, let's consider trading in Troy as opposed to Pharaoh. What is really annoying to deal with Pharaoh is the fact that when you're looking to, say, buy a particular resource, you can only see that if a faction has a lot of, say, food or wood or anything like that in the screen over here. Now, I'm guessing to some extent the developers were like, yeah, let's not tell the player how many resources a faction has, but you can actually see how many resources a faction has. But because one of the things you can do in Pharaoh is just go to a faction that you want to trade with and see and just demand however much resources they have, and you can see how much they will have. So it's a pointless decision that they made over there in Pharaoh Dynasties, because they're trying to keep it hidden, but they're not. They're just forcing you as a player to go through multiple steps in order to achieve the same damn result. That is frustrating to actually deal with. Another thing that I would really like to have from Troy, to some extent may be adapted, but it would actually have to deal with the gods. And I'm not just talking about Rhesus, but just the gods in general. The faith system of Pharaoh, let me be blunt about it, leaves a lot to be desired. Yes, you build shrines and temple, you can do so the same in Troy, or you can at least build temples. That's not what I'm talking about over here. Is how you worship the gods and that mechanic. So the way that this works is you have to build temples to gain favor with a particular god, but favor does decline, quite importantly. So you have to continuously keep improving, building more temples, doing prayers, doing a hecatomb. That is actually a very crucial element from where I'm standing on this. Now, I'm not saying that you should get the same kind of benefits, though there are certainly some gods that are very beneficial. Though it's also worth pointing out that one of the major freaking benefits they do have in Troy as opposed to Pharaoh is you can choose which god you're going to worship. Like, let's say, for instance, if I'm playing a campaign in Troy, the problem that existed, and still exists obviously, is the fact that Aphrodite beats everyone out of the water because she gives you happiness and growth, and those two are very important. And then you got Hephaestus, who flat out gives you better units. So there are issues with the way this was balanced, but the intent of the system is not bad, because you, in theory, and really in practice at one point in a campaign, sure, you might always start with Aphrodite, just as you might always start with one particular god that's better than others. The game literally forces you in Pharaoh to go with one particular god, because otherwise you'd always go for the same kind of god that's most beneficial in the early game. That's still a problem there, by the way. You, like, literally your second god, the one you unlock, like, one of the things I've said in a lot of videos is, like, always go for the extra god slot, because there are gods that are flat out better than others. So this is a problem that's carried over. I just feel the system of faith is better in Troy than Pharaoh. It's certainly more engaging, and you have to worry about. Now, I understand the historical aspect and all that, but there is a historical mode in Troy as well. Just keep in mind, I may have started this with Mythos, but there is a historical mode in Troy, and it works the same way. You just don't get mythological units and army abilities for it. But many of the benefits do actually stay the same. Now, another thing on top of this is you do have Thracian rituals over here that Rhesus exclusively has access to, which goes even further because it gives you various offerings to various gods and some significant benefits over here as well. And also gives you an extra resource that is devotion. And devotion, beyond just, the fact that you're getting various benefits through these kind of rituals, for either a couple of turns or along these lines. Beyond that, you can also use this devotion to recruit the Countless Host. Now, Countless Host is basically a disposable army. Well, or not really. It's a kind of unique horde army that can't be reinforced or reinforced, but it's a pretty powerful one. I do dislike the way they decided to handle this entire DLC, because this was a DLC, because they made it so horde armies can't be reinforced by one another. Really crappy system there. What was it, Attila or Warriors of Chaos? No, they could, but it's just like they were bad in close proximity. The horde army mechanic has always been a problem for CA. Regardless of that, this system is great because you spawn a horde army with, you build up this devotion and then you spawn a horde army. This could be an interesting system. I mean, fanatics have always existed throughout the course of history, so hey, why not use that particular mechanic? You do have to invest in it. It's not like you're getting it for free. You do actually have to put effort and invest for it, and then you get the payoff. And it does feel like a pretty good system that they could add in Pharaoh. Maybe not quite as powerful or as ridiculous, but still certainly some benefits from it. The final thing to talk about is actually related to the Amazons, the pre-order DLC bonus. That wasn't at launch, so they came out later, but they do have some really, really great features. Some of which have been great features that CA already added in Warhammer 3, and I really wish they would spread this around more, because it is one of the best systems that came out of Troy, and that is the Warband upgrade system. It's not called that, but it's still the same thing. So the way it works is fairly simple. You have a selection of upgrades with initiation rights that you have for your units. Ignore the tutorials over there. So you start with basic units and you have to upgrade them. I think this system is fantastic because one of the problems we have in virtually every Total War game that's come out ever is the fact that, yeah, early on you want to recruit some basic units, but then later on you do want to replace those units. But you kind of want to keep the same units rolling around, right? Because you get attached to your army that's been winning you a lot of battles. But you end up having to replace them. This is why the Warband Upgrade mod for Warhammer 3 is so incredibly popular. This is one of the best things EA came up with, and they literally don't have it in Pharaoh. They should. And I don't mean just one faction. All factions should have it. It should cost resources. Maybe the same resources they would require to recruit a new unit. Fair enough. Maybe a bit less. Okay, whatever. And it should require a level of experience, maybe, and the structures as well. It shouldn't be like Warriors of Chaos where you just get research and can just upgrade units willy-nilly. No, it should require structures. But it should be available. Fantastic system, great all around, really works well, really makes your army feel yours as opposed to just having a bunch of units that you couldn't care less about because, yeah, I'm just going to recruit a bunch of tier 5 units the moment I can get them. It is such a great system because it does attach you to your army, it keeps you going, it makes the army more unique, it feels better in a campaign. Now, on top of that, we also have the Amazon Kingdom. Venestalia is not a particularly great character to play, but Hippolyta does have a really great campaign system over here that's unique to her. So what you do over here is you get various Amazon treasures, and then you unlock various milestones over here that give you certain benefits over here. So for certain objectives. So for instance, once I get 10 Amazon treasures, I can use an ability over here that gives a unit a rank, which is particularly great combined with the recruitment and upgrade system that Amazons inherently use. Then you have treasures, which is the same for a hero, which is a general leading an army. Instant research, again, you get these resources and then you use them for this fantastic system. And the way you gain them, it's like, yeah, literally go out there and fight freaking battles. That is it. There's nothing particularly, or rather, you gain those resources throughout the course of your campaign. Nothing particularly complicated in it, but such a fantastic system, especially when paired together with the unit upgrade system. And it just makes it so that you have a system that scales up as you play through the campaign. Not the most powerful when you start out, but it does naturally progress and become really, really good. And one of the problems that Total War does have inherently is how do you make the late game interesting, right? Well, we've seen various systems applied to this. Like, one of the things that I like about this Skaven, for instance, obviously, is like their ability of just taking tier 5 settlements by using food. It's kind of similar, not quite as powerful, but still, you get the notion of it over here. So these are the kind of things that I would like to see taken from Troy and added in Pharaoh. Of course, we can talk about mythos, mythology units, all kinds of things, maybe some other features, but these are the ones I would very much like to see taken from Troy and added in Pharaoh. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.